Before everything changed, life had a predictable, almost monotonous rhythm for me. I had learned to navigate the days like a well-rehearsed script, moving from scene to scene with the same expressions, the same actions, and the same tightly held emotions. As a single mother, my life was a balancing act, a constant juggling of responsibilities that demanded all of my attention and left me little room to think about anything else. I wasn't always a single mom, but after my partner left, I had to adapt quickly, learn how to do everything on my own. And though I managed, sometimes even well enough to fool people into thinking I was doing just fine, there was always a quiet, nagging voice reminding me how close I was to letting it all fall apart. It wasn't the pressure that got to me. I had gotten used to that, the long hours at work, the endless cycle of laundry, cooking, and helping my kids with their schoolwork, the constant effort to stretch every dollar to the next paycheck. That part one could handle. It was the isolation that crept in late at night, after the kids were in bed and the house was finally quiet, that was harder to shake off. It was in those moments, sitting alone on the couch, when I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. I had no one to share the load, no one to lean on when the days felt too heavy. I think that's why I started drinking. At first, it was just a glass of wine in the evening, something to help me relax and unwind after a long day. But soon, one glass turned into two, and then two turned into three, until it became a routine that I relied on more than I wanted to admit. I'm not proud of it, and I never drank to the point of passing out or neglecting my kids, but there was a part of me that knew it was a problem. I justified it by telling myself that it was just a way to cope, a small indulgence I was entitled to after everything I'd been through. But deep down, I knew I was trying to escape from the loneliness, the stress, and the feeling that I was failing. I had built this wall around myself, and the wine was just a way to keep reinforcing it, to dull the sharp edges of my reality. My days would start early, always before sunrise. I'd wake up to the blare of my alarm, drag myself out of bed, and stumble into the kitchen to make coffee. I'd sip it in silence, savoring those few moments of peace before the chaos of the morning routine began. I had 2 kids, both under the age of 10, and getting them ready for school was like preparing for battle. There were lunches to pack, shoes to find, and constant negotiations over what clothes they would wear. Some mornings were smoother than others, but most of the time, I felt like I was sprinting through a maze with no end in sight. Then there was work. I had a job as a receptionist at a small dental office, a position that paid the bills but offered little in the way of fulfillment. It was a steady, reliable job, but it was also draining in its own way. I spent my days answering phones, scheduling appointments, and trying to keep a smile on my face even when I felt like screaming. There were times when I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the glass doors, and I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, worn down, like she was barely holding herself together. But I'd force myself to smile, to keep up the facade, because I didn't have the luxury of breaking down. My kids depended on me, and I couldn't afford to let them see me struggle. After work, I'd rush to pick up the kids from school, and the rest of the evening would be a blur of homework, dinner, and bedtime routines. I'd read them stories, tuck them into bed, and kiss them goodnight, always with the same promises, that I loved them, that everything would be okay, that tomorrow would be better. But once they were asleep, the house would go silent, and that's when the loneliness would creep back in. I'd pour myself a glass of wine and sink into the couch, staring blankly at the TV without really watching it, just trying to drown out the thoughts that I didn't want to face. I knew I wasn't happy. I hadn't been happy in a long time, but I had convinced myself that this was just how life was supposed to be. I was surviving, and that was enough. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. There were moments, though, when I'd see other mothers at the school drop-off, laughing and chatting with each other, and I'd feel a pang of envy. They seemed so carefree, so sure of themselves, and I couldn't help but wonder what it was like to have that kind of ease, that kind of support. I missed having someone to talk to, someone who understood what it felt like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. It's strange how quickly life can change, how a single moment can shatter everything you thought you knew. It happened on a Tuesday, a day that started like any other. I had gotten the kids off to school, gone to work, and was in the middle of my usual afternoon routine when it happened. I remember feeling a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, like someone had punched me. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a cramp or something I had eaten, but the pain kept getting worse. It felt like there was a weight pressing down on me, crushing my chest, and I started to feel lightheaded, like the room was spinning around me. I don't remember much after that. I vaguely recall someone calling out my name, and then everything went dark. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, staring up at the ceiling with a group of worried faces hovering above me. I could hear someone saying that an ambulance was on the way, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, like they were coming from underwater. I wanted to tell them that I was okay, that they didn't need to worry, but I couldn't speak. My mouth wouldn't move, and my vision was starting to blur. It was like my body was shutting down, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The darkness closed in, swallowing me whole, and for a moment, I thought that was it. I thought I was going to die right there on the floor of that office, surrounded by people I barely knew. But then something strange happened. I felt myself being pulled, like I was being dragged backward through a tunnel, and there was a loud, roaring noise all around me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, a cold, creeping sensation that crawled over my skin, like icy fingers wrapping around my limbs. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was powerless, trapped in this dark, suffocating space. I don't know how long I was in that state. Time didn't seem to exist there. It was just an endless, suffocating void. But then, out of nowhere, I felt a sudden jolt, like I had been shocked back to life. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself standing in the middle of a vast, empty expanse. There was nothing around me, just a cold gray mist that stretched out in every direction. I felt disoriented, like I had been dropped into a dream that I couldn't wake up from. And then I heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like a voice calling out to me from somewhere far away. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by something invisible. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten there, but I knew with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone. There was something out there, lurking in the mist, watching me. I could feel its presence, a dark, oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I tried to call out, but my voice was lost in the fog, swallowed up by the silence that surrounded me. That was the moment when I felt it, a cold, bony hand wrapping around my wrist, pulling me deeper into the mist. I couldn't see who or what it was, but I could feel its grip tightening, dragging me forward against my will. Panic surged through me, and I tried to pull away, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the tighter its grip became, and I felt myself being pulled deeper and deeper into the darkness. The mist thickened around me, swirling like a living, breathing thing. It was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The cold hand that had seized my wrist was relentless, dragging me forward with a strength that felt impossible to resist. I couldn't see who or what was holding me, but I could sense its presence, looming just beyond the edges of my vision, hidden within the shadows. The more I tried to pull away, the more it tightened its grip, until I felt like my wrist was going to snap under the pressure. The whispering was back, louder now, echoing all around me, as if there were voices everywhere, but I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus, a cacophony of murmurs that seemed to rise and fall, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, slipping through my mind like water through my fingers. Yet, despite not understanding the language, I felt like I could grasp the meaning, as if the voices were trying to tell me something terrible. I was being pulled deeper into the mist, and with each step, the temperature seemed to drop. The cold was seeping into my bones, numbing my skin, but the pain from the grip on my wrist burned like fire. I wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but my throat was locked, and no sound would come out. Fear was coursing through me, sharp and acidic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, to something. I knew with a certainty that felt like a dagger in my chest, that wherever I was being taken, it wasn't a place I wanted to go. As I was dragged forward, the mist began to thin, and I could make out vague shapes ahead of me. Shadows, dark and shifting, moving slowly through the haze. They weren't solid, they flickered, like figures seen through a veil, their outlines distorted and strange. I could see their eyes, those small glowing pinpricks of light that blinked in and out of the darkness, watching me. They were getting closer, surrounding me, their eyes piercing through the fog, and I realized with a jolt of terror that they weren't just watching, they were following. Stalking. I forced myself to look straight ahead, focusing on the direction I was being dragged, and that's when I saw it. Up ahead, through the thinning mist, a dark shape loomed, enormous and foreboding. It was a silhouette at first, a vague outline that seemed to pulse and shift, like it was breathing. But as I got closer, the details began to sharpen, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was a figure, towering and impossibly tall, draped in shadows that clung to it like a second skin. Its form was almost human, but twisted, with limbs that were too long and a head that seemed to stretch unnaturally high, as if trying to break free from the darkness that enveloped it. I was close enough now to see its eyes. They were dark, hollow pits that seemed to suck in the light around them, drawing everything into a black void. I couldn't look away. The eyes held me, pinned me in place, even as the cold, skeletal hand continued to drag me forward. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but my feet kept moving, even though every part of me was screaming to turn back to run. I knew I should be terrified, but there was something mesmerizing about the figure, something that made it impossible to look away. It was like staring into an abyss, and the more I looked, the more I felt like I was falling into it, losing pieces of myself in the darkness. As I drew closer, the voices grew louder, swelling into a chorus of whispers that reverberated in my head. They weren't just random sounds anymore, they were saying my name. Over and over, repeating it like a chant, like a taunt. The figure's mouth moved, opening slowly, and I realized that it was speaking, but the words were coming from everywhere, not just its lips. The voices were inside my head, echoing through the empty space, filling the silence with a sound that was both familiar and completely alien. "Why do you run?" the voices asked, 1,000 different tones blending into one. "Why do you hide?" I didn't know how to answer. I didn't even know if they wanted an answer. But the questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last, each one cutting deeper. "Do you think you can escape?" they whispered, their voices dripping with something that felt like amusement. "Do you think you can hide from us, from yourself?" The figure's eyes bore into mine, and I felt something shift inside me, a flicker of recognition that made my stomach churn. I realized then what I was looking at, or at least part of it. It wasn't just a shadow, not just a monster. It was a reflection, a twisted, distorted mirror of everything I had been hiding from, everything I didn't want to face. The drinking, the late nights alone, the bitterness that had been building up inside me for years. It was all there, staring back at me, taunting me, daring me to deny it. "No," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "This isn't me. This can't be me." The figure leaned closer, its face inches from mine, and I could feel its breath, cold and rancid, on my skin. "Isn't it?" it hissed. "Look closer. See what you've become." I didn't want to look. I wanted to close my eyes, to turn away, but I couldn't. The figure's gaze held me, forcing me to confront everything I had tried so hard to bury. I saw flashes of my life, images flickering like scenes from an old film reel. Nights spent alone, a glass of wine clutched tightly in my hand, my kids asleep in the next room, oblivious to how broken their mother was. Moments of weakness, of anger, of despair. It all played out in front of me, and I felt sick, like I was being ripped apart from the inside. "Do you see now?" the voices murmured, their tone almost gentle. "Do you understand?" I didn't want to understand. I wanted to scream, to tear myself away from this nightmare, but I was trapped, held in place by the cold, unyielding hand that still gripped my wrist. "I'm not like this," I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm trying to be better. Trying." The voices laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the darkness. "Trying is not enough. You have failed. You have failed yourself, and you have failed those who depend on you." The words cut deep, like a blade sliding between my ribs. I wanted to argue, to fight back, but there was a part of me that knew they were right. I had been trying, but trying wasn't the same as succeeding. I had been failing over and over, and no matter how much I tried to pretend otherwise, I couldn't hide it anymore. The figure's grip tightened, and I could feel my wrist throbbing, the pain sharp and insistent. "You can't run from this," it said, its voice low and sinister. "You can't hide from the truth. You carry it with you, wherever you go. It is part of you, and it always will be." I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The figure tilted its head, considering me. "We want you to see," it said. "We want you to understand. You cannot escape who you are. You cannot hide from your own reflection." And then, as if to prove its point, the mist around me began to shift. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that became more and more distinct. I saw faces, my own face, but twisted, contorted with rage, with sorrow, with fear. I saw my children, their eyes wide with confusion, their small hands reaching out for me, only to grasp at nothing. I saw the empty wine bottles, the darkened room where I sat alone night after night, the silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. "You built this," the voices said, their tone almost sympathetic. "This is your creation. This is the world you have chosen. I wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, but the images wouldn't stop. They kept coming, a relentless tide of memories and regrets, and I felt like I was drowning in them. Every mistake I had ever made, every moment of weakness, every harsh word spoken in frustration, every night I had spent numbing myself instead of facing the truth, it was all there, laid out in front of me, inescapable. The figure leaned closer, its dark eyes boring into mine, and I could see myself reflected in them, small and broken. "This is who you are," it said, its voice soft but firm. "And until you accept that, you will never be free." I felt something inside me shatter, a piece of my soul breaking off and falling away. I didn't want to accept it. I didn't want to believe that this was all I was, that this was all I would ever be. But the truth was there, staring me in the face, and I couldn't run from it anymore. The cold skeletal hand released my wrist, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse, the weight of everything I had been carrying finally bearing down on me. But I didn't fall. I stood there, trembling, staring at the figure in front of me, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It wasn't just a monster. It was me. Or at least, it was the parts of me I had tried so hard to ignore, the parts one didn't want to admit were there. The mist began to recede, and I felt the cold start to lift, but the figure didn't disappear. It stayed there, hovering at the edge of my vision, a dark shadow that would always be with me. "This is your truth," it said, its voice fading into a whisper. "And now you must decide what to do with it." As the mist cleared, I realized I was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss that stretched out infinitely below me. I felt the wind tugging at me, pulling me towards the edge, and I knew that if I stepped forward, I would fall. I would be lost, swallowed up by the darkness. But there was something else too, a faint glimmer of light, far off in the distance, barely visible but there like a beacon calling out to me. I didn't know where it led, or what it meant, but I knew I had to make a choice. I could stay here, with the darkness, with the truth I had tried so hard to deny. Or I could step forward into the unknown, and see if there was something more, something beyond the shadows. The figure's eyes glowed, watching me, waiting. "Choose," it said. I stood there, on the edge of that abyss, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The darkness stretched out below me, vast and endless, and I could still feel the weight of those words pressing down on me, suffocating and inescapable. "This is who you are," the figure's voice echoed in my mind, a relentless whisper that seemed to seep into my very bones, reminding me of every failure, every weakness, every moment I had tried so desperately to forget. I wanted to close my eyes, to turn away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, caught between the endless void at my feet and the faint flickering light that seemed so far away, like a distant star barely piercing the night. The darkness around me began to shift, curling and coiling like smoke, and out of it, I saw the figure again, standing tall and menacing, its hollow eyes fixed on me. But as I watched, something changed. The shadows seemed to ripple, and a new presence emerged, stepping forward into the dim gray light. It was a figure of light, luminous and gentle, and as it moved closer, the darkness around me began to recede, as if it were being pushed back, driven away by this new warmth. I blinked, struggling to understand what I was seeing, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining it, that this was just another cruel trick of my mind. But then I heard a voice, soft and calm, cutting through the oppressive silence. "You don't have to be afraid," the voice said. "Not anymore." I turned, and there, standing before me, was a figure unlike anything I had ever seen. It was radiant, glowing softly, and I couldn't make out its face. It was as if it was shrouded in light, too bright to see clearly but not blinding. There was a warmth emanating from it, a gentle, soothing energy that seemed to wash over me, easing the cold, numbing fear that had been gripping my heart. For the first time since I had been dragged into this nightmare, I felt a flicker of hope, like a small flame kindling in the dark. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, trembling and uncertain. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it stepped closer, and as it did, I felt the darkness around me begin to lift, thinning out like mist burned away by the morning sun. The oppressive presence of the shadowy figure, the one that had taunted me, forced me to confront all my worst fears, seemed to waver, its shape blurring, fading into the background. I could still sense it there, lingering at the edges of my vision, but its power was weakening, its hold on me loosening. "I am here to help you see," the figure of light said, its voice as soft as a whisper but filled with an undeniable strength. "To help you understand." "Understand what?" I asked, a tremor of anger slipping into my voice. "That I'm a failure?" That I've been running away from my own life? I already know that. I don't need to see it again. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my words. No, it said gently. Not to remind you of your failures, but to show you that there is more. More to you, more to this life, than the darkness you have allowed to consume you. I wanted to believe it, but a part of me resisted, clinging stubbornly to the despair that had become so familiar. How can there be more? I asked, my voice cracking. I've seen who I am. I've seen what I've done. How can there be anything beyond that? For a moment, there was silence, and then the figure of light extended its hand, reaching out to me. Because you are more than your mistakes, it said. You are more than your fears, more than the pain you carry. You have forgotten, but you are not lost. You can still find your way back. I hesitated, staring at the outstretched hand, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, hope, fear, doubt, all swirling together. The words were comforting, but they felt so far from the reality I knew, so distant from the truth I had been forced to confront. I don't know how, I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. I've tried, but I always end up back here. The figure's hand remained steady, unwavering, and for a moment, I felt something stir deep within me, a small, fragile spark that had been buried beneath layers of guilt and self-loathing. You are stronger than you know, the figure said. And you are not alone. Even when you thought no one could see you, when you felt like you were drowning in the dark, there was light waiting for you, guiding you. You just have to reach for it. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. I was so tired of fighting, so tired of pretending that I could handle everything on my own. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached out, my hand trembling as I took the figure's hand in mine. The moment our hands touched, I felt a warmth spread through me, a gentle, comforting heat that seemed to seep into every corner of my being, melting away the cold, the fear, the doubt. It was like stepping out of a storm into the sunlight, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. The figure of light smiled, a soft, serene smile that radiated kindness. There is still time, it said. Time to heal, time to change. The darkness may always be a part of you, but it does not have to define you. You can choose to move forward, to let go of the past, and embrace the light that is within you. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth wash over me, and in that moment, I felt something shift, something deep and profound. It was as if a weight I had been carrying for years was finally lifting, dissolving into nothing. The darkness was still there, lingering at the edges, but it no longer felt as overwhelming, as suffocating. I could see it for what it was, a part of me, but not all of me. And for the first time, I felt like I could face it, not with fear, but with acceptance. How? I whispered. How do I change? How do I stop running from it? The figure's eyes, though still hidden in the light, seemed to soften. By starting small, it said. By forgiving yourself. You are allowed to make mistakes. You are allowed to be imperfect. But you must also allow yourself to grow, to learn, to find joy in the little things. It won't be easy, and there will be days when the darkness feels closer than ever. But you are not alone. You never have been. Those words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my throat tighten as a sob threatened to escape. I thought of my children, of all the times I had felt like I was failing them, of the nights I had spent alone, convincing myself that I was beyond saving. But now here, in this place that felt both unreal and more real than anything I had ever known, I realized that I had been wrong. I wasn't beyond saving. I wasn't alone. There was still hope, still a chance to change, if I was willing to reach for it. The figure of light gently squeezed my hand, and I felt a surge of strength, of courage. It's time to go back, it said, and I could feel the light around me beginning to dim, the warmth fading. But remember this, remember what you have seen here. You have the strength to face your fears, to embrace the light. Trust in that, even when it seems impossible. I wanted to say something, to thank the figure, to ask for more time, but before I could speak, the light flared, bright and blinding, and then everything went dark. For a moment, I felt like I was falling, plummeting through an endless void, and then just as suddenly I was back. I gasped, my eyes snapping open, and I found myself staring up at the fluorescent lights of a hospital room. I could hear the steady beep of monitors, the murmur of voices nearby, and I realized with a start that I was alive. I was back in the real world, but I could still feel the warmth of that light, still hear the echo of that gentle, reassuring voice. It wasn't just a dream. It had been real as anything I had ever experienced, and it had left a mark on me, a small glowing ember that I could still feel burning in my chest. As I lay there, trying to make sense of everything, I felt a tear slide down my cheek, followed by another. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of relief, of release. I had been given something precious, something I hadn't even realized I needed, a chance to start over, to find my way back to the light. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could do it. It wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be days when the darkness would feel overwhelming, when the old fears and doubts would try to creep back in. But now, I had something to hold on to, a promise that I wasn't alone, that I could be more than my mistakes. I didn't know what the future would bring, but as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I knew one thing for certain: I was going to fight. I was going to fight to be better, to find the light even in the darkest moments, and to show my children that it was possible to find hope, even when it seemed like all was lost. The path ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but I was ready to face it. Because now, I knew that the light was always there waiting, no matter how deep the darkness might seem. Waking up in the hospital was like surfacing from the deepest part of the ocean, gasping for air, disoriented and unsure if I was truly back. The bright, sterile light stung my eyes, and the sounds around me, the beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of nurses, felt distant, like they were coming from another world. My body ached, my throat was dry, and when I tried to move, it was as if I was fighting through layers of exhaustion that threatened to pull me under again. But I was awake. I was alive. And the reality of that slowly began to sink in. A nurse noticed my stirring and quickly came over, calling out to the others. "She's awake," she said, and I could see the relief on her face, like she had been waiting for this moment. Within minutes, there were doctors around me, asking questions, checking my vitals, but their words barely registered. My mind was still trapped somewhere between the hospital room and that other place, where I had stood on the edge of the abyss, facing the darkest parts of myself. I could still feel the warmth of that light, the strength it had given me, but now it felt fragile, like it could slip away if I let go. My family was notified, and not long after, my mother rushed into the room, her face a mix of relief and panic. She held my hand, tears in her eyes, asking me what had happened, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I? How could I make her understand what I had seen, what I had felt? It was like trying to describe a dream that felt more real than waking life, but also more impossible. So I just told her what she needed to hear, that I was okay, that I was glad to be back, and that we would talk about it later. The doctors said I had experienced a sudden cardiac arrest, something they couldn't fully explain given my medical history. They were cautious in their explanations, using terms like lucky and miracle, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. It was as if they were trying to make sense of something that defied their understanding. I wanted to tell them what I had seen, what I had learned, but I knew they would only chalk it up to hallucinations, a byproduct of my brain shutting down. So I kept it to myself, letting their clinical explanations wash over me without absorbing them. Over the next few days, I focused on recovering, on regaining my strength, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. It wasn't just that I had survived, it was the way I had come back, with this newfound sense of purpose that I didn't fully understand yet. I found myself replaying the words of that gentle, luminous figure over and over, clinging to them like a lifeline. Asterisk, you are more than your mistakes. You can still find your way back. Asterisk, those words had pulled me out of the darkest place I had ever been, and now they were guiding me as I tried to navigate the world again. But when I was finally discharged from the hospital and returned home, I was hit with the reality of how difficult this new path would be. My house was just as I had left it, a mess of half-empty wine glasses, laundry piled up, and bills scattered across the kitchen counter. It was like stepping back into the remnants of my old life, the one I had thought I could leave behind. And as much as I wanted to hold on to that sense of hope, it started slipping away the moment I walked through the door. My mother had stayed with the kids while I was in the hospital, and when she brought them home, I was overwhelmed with emotion. They hugged me, their little arms tight around my neck, and I promised them that everything was going to be different, that I was going to be better. But even as I said the words, a part of me wondered if I could keep that promise. I had tried before so many times to be stronger, to be more present, and I had always failed. What made this time any different? The first few days were the hardest. I wanted to throw out the bottles of wine, to clear away all the reminders of my old habits, but every time I tried, I felt this gnawing anxiety, this fear that I wasn't ready. So I left them where they were, convincing myself that I would get to it later, that it was enough just to be trying. I tried to keep busy, to distract myself with chores and errands, but every quiet moment was a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. I could feel the darkness lurking at the edges of my mind, waiting for a chance to creep back in, and it terrified me. I knew I needed help, but I didn't know where to start. I thought about telling my mother, but she was already so worried about me, and I didn't want to burden her with the full weight of what I was going through. I tried talking to a few friends, but their reactions were mixed. Some listened, nodding sympathetically, but I could see the doubt in their eyes, like they weren't sure if they should take me seriously. Others dismissed it outright, telling me that I had just been through a traumatic experience and that it would take time to feel normal again. They didn't understand that this wasn't just about recovering from a physical ordeal. This was about something deeper, something that had been inside me long before my heart stopped beating. I thought about what the doctors had said, about the possibility of hallucinations, and for a moment, I wondered if they were right. Maybe it had all been in my head, a desperate attempt to make sense of something I couldn't control. But when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the warmth of that light, could still hear that voice telling me that I wasn't alone. That feeling was too real to be a lie, too powerful to be just a figment of my imagination. I had to believe that it meant something, that it was a sign that I could change, even if no one else understood. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat down in the living room and stared at the empty wine bottle on the coffee table. I had been avoiding this moment all day, keeping myself busy with everything else, but now there was nowhere left to hide. I picked up the bottle, feeling its weight in my hand, and for a long time, I just held it, trying to make sense of the mix of emotions swirling inside me. I thought about how many nights I had spent just like this, sitting alone in the dark, trying to numb the pain, trying to escape the guilt. But this time was different. This time, I could see it for what it was, a crutch, a way to avoid facing the things I didn't want to deal with. And as I sat there, I realized that I didn't want to live like this anymore. I didn't want to be trapped in this cycle of self-destruction, constantly running from my own feelings. I wanted to be better, not just for myself, but for my kids, for the people who still believed in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. So I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked into the kitchen. I opened the cupboard where I kept the other bottles, and one by one, I took them out and poured them down the sink. It felt like a small, almost insignificant gesture, but as I watched the wine swirl down the drain, I felt a weight lift off my chest. It wasn't just about getting rid of the alcohol. It was about making a choice, about taking the first step towards something different. The next day, I called a therapist, someone who specialized in addiction and recovery. It was one of the hardest phone calls I had ever made, but I knew it was necessary. I needed someone to help me navigate this, to help me understand why I had been so afraid to face my own pain. I started going to regular sessions, and slowly, I began to unravel the knots inside me, to confront the fears and insecurities that had been driving my behavior for so long. It wasn't an easy process. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, like I was finally starting to understand myself, and then there were days when I felt like I was right back where I started, drowning in the same old doubts and fears. But each time I felt myself slipping, I remembered that light, that warmth, and it gave me the strength to keep going. I held on to that memory like a lifeline, a reminder that I could still find my way back, even when it felt impossible. I also started opening up to my kids, in ways I hadn't before. I had always tried to protect them from my struggles, to keep them from seeing how much I was hurting, but I realized that they needed to understand why things were going to be different. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough for them to know that I was trying to change, that I was doing this because I wanted to be there for them, truly be there. Their response was simple, but it meant everything to me. They hugged me, told me they loved me, and in that moment, I knew I was on the right path. As the weeks went by, I found myself reaching out to other single mothers, joining support groups where I could share my story and listen to theirs. It was a strange, vulnerable feeling, exposing my weaknesses to strangers, but it also felt liberating. I realized that I wasn't alone, that there were so many others who were struggling, just like me, trying to find their own light in the darkness. We supported each other, lifted each other up, and in doing so, I felt that same warmth I had experienced during my near-death experience. It was as if, by opening myself up to others, I was reconnecting with that light, letting it shine through me in a way I had never been able to before. I still had bad days. There were times when I felt like I was slipping, like the old habits and fears were creeping back in, trying to pull me under. But I was learning how to fight them, how to stand my ground and hold on to the things that mattered. I was learning how to live again, not just survive, and it was a journey that I knew would take time, maybe even the rest of my life. But for the first time, I felt like I was truly living, truly fighting for something real. And every time I felt that familiar pull, the temptation to fall back into the old patterns, I would close my eyes and remember the warmth of that light, the gentle voice that had reached out to me in my darkest moment. It reminded me that I was not alone, that I was more than my mistakes, and that I still had the power to change. It was a promise I made to myself, and to the people I loved, that I would keep moving forward, one step at a time, no matter how difficult the path might be. Months passed, and slowly, life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was different. Better. I had learned to confront my fears, to face the parts of myself I had tried so hard to hide, and in doing so, I found a strength I didn't know I had. The dark days still came, but they didn't have the same hold on me anymore. I could feel them approaching, like a storm on the horizon, but now I knew how to brace myself, how to stand tall and let them pass without losing my way. I kept going to therapy, and each session helped me understand a little more about myself, about why I had turned to alcohol and isolation as a means of coping. I began to see that it wasn't just about what had happened in the past, but how I had learned to deal with it, or rather, how I had learned to avoid dealing with it. I had spent so long trying to numb my feelings, to push them down and pretend they didn't exist, that I had forgotten how to feel anything at all. But now, I was learning how to let myself feel, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. I noticed it in small things, like how I started waking up before the alarm, feeling a sense of purpose instead of dread, or how I could sit with my kids at the dinner table without that nagging urge to escape into a glass of wine. I started finding joy in the simple everyday moments that I had once taken for granted, watching my daughter's face light up when she told me about her day at school, or the way my son would lean against me when we read bedtime stories. These moments were fleeting, but they were real, and I had missed out on so many of them because I had been too caught up in my own struggle to notice. I didn't realize how much I had changed until one evening, when I was sitting on the couch, watching my kids play a board game together. They were laughing, their faces bright with joy, and I felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over me. For so long, I had been trapped in this cycle of self-pity, of feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I was failing them. But as I watched them, I realized that they didn't see me that way. To them, I was just Mom, the person who made them breakfast in the morning, who helped them with their homework, who kissed them goodnight. They didn't see my flaws, my mistakes. They just saw me, and they loved me. That realization was like a revelation, a reminder that I didn't have to be perfect to be enough. As I continued to heal, I felt a growing desire to reach out, to connect with others who might be going through something similar. I knew how isolating it could be, how easy it was to feel like you were the only one struggling, the only one who couldn't get it together. I started attending meetings for single mothers, sharing my story with them, and it was both terrifying and freeing. At first, I was scared of how they might see me, scared of the judgment, but instead, I found compassion and understanding. They listened, they nodded, and in their eyes, I saw the same struggles, the same fears. And then one day, I decided to do something that felt both exhilarating and completely out of character. I signed up to speak at a local support group for people recovering from addiction. It was a small gathering, held in the basement of a community center, but the idea of standing up in front of strangers and talking about my experiences was daunting. Yet, as the day approached, I realized that this was something I needed to do, not just for myself, but for anyone who might be feeling the same way I once had, lost, alone, and convinced that there was no way out. The night of the meeting, I stood at the front of the room, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I looked out at the faces staring back at me, some curious, some guarded, and I took a deep breath. I started talking, slowly at first, but then the words began to flow, as if they had been waiting to be spoken. I told them about my near-death experience, about the darkness I had faced, and the light that had pulled me back. I told them about the struggle to change, the fear of failing again, and the small hesitant steps I had taken to rebuild my life. For the first time, I shared the full story, not just the parts that were easy to tell, but the parts that hurt, the parts that made me feel vulnerable and exposed. And as I spoke, I saw heads nodding, hands reaching out to squeeze the shoulder of the person next to them, and I knew that they understood. They weren't judging me, they were seeing themselves in my story, recognizing their own pain, their own fears. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then someone started clapping, and soon the whole room was filled with applause. It wasn't the applause that mattered, though. It was the feeling of connection, of knowing that my words had resonated with them, that they had heard me and understood. For so long, I had been afraid of being seen, afraid of what people would think if they knew the truth. But now, I realized that there was strength in vulnerability, in being honest about who you are and what you've been through. After the meeting, a few people came up to me, thanking me for sharing my story. One woman, with tears in her eyes, told me that she had been struggling with her own addiction for years and had never felt like she could talk about it. "Hearing you tonight," she said, her voice trembling, "made me feel like I'm not alone. Like maybe I can find a way out, too." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my own eyes welling up with tears. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that, to know that my experience could make a difference, even if it was just for one person. It was a reminder that we are all connected, that no matter how isolated we might feel, there are others who understand, who are walking their own difficult paths. In the months that followed, I continued to speak at meetings, to share my story whenever I had the chance. I wasn't trying to fix anyone or offer easy solutions. I knew from my own experience that there were no quick fixes. But I wanted to be there, to listen, to let people know that they weren't alone. It was a small way of giving back, of paying forward the kindness and understanding that had been shown to me. My life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments when the old fears crept back in, whispering that I wasn't strong enough, that I would slip up again. But I was learning to push back against those voices, to remind myself that I had already faced my darkest fears and come out on the other side. I had found a light in that darkness, and as long as I held on to it, I knew I would be okay. One evening, I was sitting outside, watching the sunset, when my daughter came and sat beside me. She was quiet for a moment, then she turned to me and asked, "Mom, are you happy now?" It was such a simple question, but it carried so much weight. I thought about everything I had been through, about the journey I was still on, and I realized that I was. I was happy, not in the way I had once imagined. Not a perfect fairy tale happiness, but a deeper, quieter kind of contentment. "Yes," I said, pulling her close. "I am." And as I held her, I felt that warmth again, that same warmth I had felt in my near-death experience. And I knew that it hadn't been a dream or a hallucination. It was real as anything I had ever felt, and it was still with me, guiding me, reminding me that no matter how dark things might get, there was always a way forward, always a way back to the light. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew that there would still be difficult days ahead. But I also knew that I wasn't alone, and that I had the strength to keep going, to keep finding joy in the little things, and to keep reaching out to others who needed to hear that they could do the same. The experience that had nearly taken my life had also given me a gift. The gift of clarity, of purpose, of understanding that we are all more than our mistakes, more than our pain. We are capable of change, of growth, of finding light even in the darkest places. And that was a truth I would carry with me, always, as I continued to navigate the messy, beautiful, unpredictable journey of life.